The massive move west was underway by 1900, and Congress passed the Reclamation Act, funding irrigation projects in the Yakima, Wenatchee, and Okanagan valleys. Supporters believed that irrigation and reclamation would encourage continuous settlement of the West and make the desert bloom.
Most of it was sagebrush, and you had the valley along the creek that was grass, because that's where all the sub and the water was. But up here in the drier part, well, if it had good sagebrush, it was farmable. And they sold certain parts of the ground to individuals so that money would go for construction. And that allowed them to start building irrigation projects.
In the Yakima Valley, the water changed the atmosphere of farming. New crops were being produced. Potatoes were especially difficult, but a handful of Yakima Valley farmers grew them hoping for higher prices. Planting wasn't easy, and harvest was backbreaking.
It was all picked up by hand, put in a sack. You went through and lifted the potatoes, and then the people went through and put those, they had a sack that they had a potato belt. And they drug that sack and filled it, and then they stopped it, make another. And then those were picked up by hand and put on the wagon and taken to town.
Yakima was an early hub for potato farming on the east side of the Cascades. As the railroads were coming in, farmers loaded up the rail cars with their commodities to sell to America. In 1908, while talking to Yakima Valley farmers, Northern Pacific Railroad's dining car superintendent, Hazen Titus, learned that the farmers were having a hard time selling their incredibly large potatoes. They were thought to be too big to serve in gourmet restaurants. Titus bought as many of the giant potatoes as the farmers could grow, baked them, and served them with butter to the hungry diners heading west in his rail cars. The potatoes were such a hit with diners that they became the signature trademark of the railroad. Posters, signs, spoons, postcards, all bore the image of the potato, and the northern tracks were forever known as the route of the great big baked potato.
The dining car, get a great big baked potato.
Railroads were bringing people to the West like never before. By 1914, the state of Washington had more rail line than any other state west of the Mississippi.
Well, I don't think Quincy would be here if the railroad had not come through here, for one thing. There's just really nothing here to draw anybody. So it was because the railroad went through that allowed them to want to develop and sell off the land along the railroad and get people to settle here.
By that time, more irrigation projects were slowly making their way across central Washington. Construction of the High Line Canal Kittitas Irrigation Project began in 1926. And Ellensburg became a boom town for agriculture and opportunity. Eric Moe took a gamble that settling in the Kittitas Valley would pay off. A former ranch hand, Moe saved up his money to buy a farm. He planted potatoes, and like many others in the area, helped transform the Ellensburg region into a thriving agricultural hub. Moe's son, Joe, eventually earned the right to run the farm. He soon partnered with another potato grower, Maury Balcom, a man known for his brilliant marketing skills.
That's what they say. You know, he could sell anything to anybody. And that's what that attracted he and Joe Moe together. Because Joe was a farmer and Dad was a marketer, and Joe realized he had to have that marketing in order to really make the potato deal do what he wanted it to do. And they found each other and became partners, and they're like brothers.
That brotherhood became known as Balcom and Moe. Utilizing their unique skills, the men built one of the most successful potato farming companies in the Northwest. It expanded throughout central Washington and into other crops, but has stayed a family business with Kittitas roots. By the mid-1920s, Kittitas Valley potato farmers were irrigating their land and growing crops, putting it far ahead of the rest of the central and eastern portions of the state. People moved to the area from every part of the nation to farm in the Kittitas.
I know we lived in a tent right beside the field, and we'd move the tent from field to field as we harvested the potatoes.
For some, like Alan Floyd, The potato business has been in their blood for decades.
I was 5 years old shaking potatoes off of vines for my dad while he drug a sack between his legs and picked the potatoes off the ground. My dad got into potatoes just for necessity, to feed the family. His dad and brothers all picked potatoes and hauled potatoes with little single-tire trucks to the warehouses to be sorted. All there was in those days was fresh packed potatoes. There wasn't any processors. And so it was a pretty small scale operation.
Allen learned the business side of potatoes from his dad and other industry greats like Pete Tagaris. With only a third-grade education, Tagaris emigrated from Greece and settled near Prosser. Pete turned his humble beginnings into one of the largest agricultural empires in the Pacific Northwest. His potato processing business grew into one of the largest in the nation.
Pete was probably the most dynamic man that I've ever met in my life. He controlled a room when he walked through the door. He wasn't afraid to take a risk, but again, he pushed people hard, but when it came to helping, he was always there.
As the 1930s approached, most areas throughout Washington were in the middle of one of the worst droughts in history. Dry stream beds resulted in power shortages throughout the Pacific Northwest. Topsoil began blowing away. The Dust Bowl wasn't just happening in Oklahoma. It was happening in Washington.
The wind always blows here in the spring, and I was headed to Quincy one night, and I couldn't even see the ornament on my hood.
It was in everything because the houses weren't very well built. You'd feel it in your mouth and in your eyes, and it was, forget about housekeeping.
Imagine 500,000 acres and a 25-mile-an-hour wind coming up, and there's no trees or grass to hold anything in place. And so 2 days later, you'd have, 2 or 3 inches of sand in your house.
Billy Johnson came west here with her brand new husband from Ohio. And of course, this was in the 40s, and they were taking a bus rather than the train here. And they got to about Ritzville, and it was very dusty, so it must have been the wind was really whipping up. And she turned to her husband and said, is this a cyclone or a tornado? And he said, honey, that's just our land blowing by.
Farmers in much of central Washington used dry land farming practices. They hauled water for their cisterns. The farmers and public appealed to Congress to fund an irrigation project, but their cries could not shake any money from the government. The nation was in the middle of the Great Depression. Unemployment was above 20%. People needed jobs. People needed hope. Gone, too, was the way of old politics. In 1932, the American people put their fate in the hands of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. His overwhelming presidential victory signaled a new way of thinking in the United States, and his election marked a new era for the farmers of Washington, for those present and for those yet to come.
Yes, the task can be helped by definite efforts to raise the values of agricultural products, and with this the power to purchase the output of our cities. It can be helped by preventing realistically the tragedy of the growing loss through foreclosure of our small homes and our farms.
Roosevelt enacted the New Deal, and jobs were the highest priority of the nation. In 1933, construction on the Grand Coulee Dam began. They meant to permanently dam the river in the same spot that glacial dams had millions of years ago.
Uncle Sam, he took the challenge in the year of 33 for the farmers and the workers and for all humanity. Now, river, you can ramble where the sun sets in the sea, but while you're rambling, river, you can do some work for me. Roll, Columbia, won't you roll, roll, roll? Roll, Columbia, won't you roll, roll, roll?
Initially, the focus of the dam was jobs and electricity. In 1934, FDR personally inspected the progress of the project and endorsed making it high enough to provide enough electricity to pump water to irrigate the Columbia Basin. Potato growing would soon open up beyond Ellensburg, Yakima, and western Washington, but it took time. The infrastructure of the Columbia Basin Project took a decade to build and deliver water to the farms of the region. The Federal Bureau of Reclamation installed more than 300 miles of canals from Quincy to the Tri-Cities area. It would forever simply be known as the Basin. It would stand for new beginnings, new hope, new life.